All right, good morning. How is everyone today? It's good to see you here for our pre-Renaissance lecture. I'd like to introduce again Neale Murray, which we have been really appreciating all his expertise and knowledge on these subjects, and so glad he's able to share them with us. We're very excited for the next series of lectures to come up this spring. However, I unfortunately don't have much information to share about when they're going to be yet. There's some renovation procedures going on here, and we don't have enough information to know yet. So as soon as we have that, we will let you know, but he has graciously agreed to do another set in the spring, and we'll bring it to you as soon as we can. With that, I'm going to introduce Neale, and a huge thank you for your sharing of all your knowledge with us. It's been a remarkable series of lectures to listen to, and today is going to be pre-Renaissance, and enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. I'd like to start today with a correction from the last lecture. If you remember, towards the end of the last lecture, I was asked the question why the cathedrals have these round windows we call rose windows, and I said I didn't know the answer to that. Well, actually, on the way home, I started to say to myself, you idiot, you in fact do know the answer to that. The rose is a messianic flower. The rose symbolizes Christ because it's blood red and it has thorns. If anyone should know why the rose would be symbolic, it should be me, because I made a large sculpture in front of a Lutheran church at the entrance of the sanctuary of the Lutheran church in Mundelein, which was a large rose, maybe so big around, surrounded by a crown of thorns. And but anyway, the rose is a messianic flower, and Chartres probably was the first place where they used the rose window. And remember, at Chartres, there was a school there. Everything at Chartres Cathedral is symbolic because it's all related to medieval theology. All the measurements and everything at Chartres are symbolic. And my guess is that's where the rose window actually came from. The pre-Renaissance, I'm calling it the pre-Renaissance today. It's sometimes called the proto-Renaissance. And the first thing I want to say to you is, date-wise, if you look at the dates of what we're looking at, it's overlapping dates from what we looked at last week in terms of development of the Gothic style. We're still in the 1300s, but we're in the 1300s in Italy now. Everything we're going to look at today is Italian. And remember, there was a difference, fundamental difference, during the Gothic style development between the Italians and the Northern Europeans, the French, the English, the Germans. And so the Italians never really got into Gothic kind of building because they were surrounded by Roman ruins and early Christian churches, which did not seek this huge height that we associate with the Gothic. So we're going to look at Italy today and prepare ourselves for the spring when we'll start with the Renaissance. One other thing, I'll reiterate this next spring with those lectures. Most art history books break at the end of the period we're going to deal with today, and there's a big heading, and it says Modern World. Most of you are surprised to think the modern world started at the beginning of the Renaissance, but historically that's the way we understand it. And the roots of that understanding we're going to get at today when we look at the pre-Renaissance or proto-Renaissance. Can we see the first slide, Jenna? I'm sorry, by the way, these images, when Jenna and I look at them on the computer, they tend to be brighter, and I don't know why. The colors diminish a little bit as we spread them out here, maybe just the sheer scale. But this is a good example of an Italian painting that's obviously very strongly influenced by the Byzantine style that we looked at a few weeks and months ago. This is by Cimabue, who was Giotto's teacher, and this style is sometimes called Greek painting because, remember, Greece is east of Italy and was very much influenced by the Byzantine style. The Byzantine style is a kind of static style of painting. The image is the figures are kind of heavenly figures, and that's the reason you have these gold backgrounds. Again, I want to emphasize the gold backgrounds are gold, and they're just as bright today as they were when they were painted because they're real gold. It's gold leaf on wood panel. And then on top of that is a tempera technique, which is essentially, as we talked about a couple times ago, a kind of watercolor technique. Not very good for blending, but you can get pretty good bright colors with tempera. Anyway, this is a typical Italian painting, clearly influenced by the Byzantine style. You'll notice the Madonna is kind of tall and thin, surrounded by angels, although they're overlapping. You notice the space is kind of flat, and not much is happening. There's no gestures, there's no emotion stated. It's just kind of there. You're meant to kind of worship the majesty of the image, and it doesn't reveal much in the way of the human dimension because the figures are thought of in heavenly terms. Now can we see the next one? By the way, these images are huge. The last one, I think it was 12 feet high. They're typically in the altar area of the Italian churches, and they're big, spacious churches. They're just as big in terms of length as the Gothic churches would be. So the image has to be really big to be seen from the distance. This one is by Giotto. Notice the date, 1310. We're just into the 1300s, and it's 10 feet 8 inches high. If any of you have been to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, the first room you enter has a series of these Maestas, that's what they're called, the Madonna in Majesty. And that Cimabue is there, this Giotto is there, and there's a big Duccio there as well. But they're all these giant gold paintings with the Madonna sitting in majesty. Now, notice the date on this. In a moment, I'm going to show you an earlier Giotto painting. Just like last time, I spent most of our time talking about Chartres Cathedral. Today I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about Giotto, because if you understand Giotto, you're prepared to understand the Renaissance. He's working in the same technique that Cimabue was, with the gold background and the angels, but you notice his Madonna is much bigger and heavier, more full-bodied. And you'll notice his space looks a little deeper. He tends to give us these foreground figures that sort of locate our position in space, and then things go back from those foreground figures. So he's already starting to think of these figures as real bodies, not as just artificial heavenly images, but bodies that have weight and physicality. Now, can I see the next one, please? Wait a minute, let's check. I want to see our order here. Okay, we'll keep it this way. This is the Renna Chapel, which is all painted by Giotto. It's not a conventional church, it's a family chapel. So it's not as big as a typical church would be. You'll notice it has only windows on one side. It's clearly not in the Gothic style. But this entire church was painted by Giotto. And notice the dates. This is painted before the Miesta we just saw. And the painting program here is the life of Christ. The upper register of the building, you notice it's got pretty much 3 layers of the paintings. The upper register is the history of the Virgin, St. Anne and Joachim the Father. And then the middle level is Christ's life, Christ's ministry. And then the lower level is Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. We're looking at the east end of the chapel right now. We're looking at the west end of the chapel. So in fact, that's the Last Judgment scene we have at the end of the chapel. Now the entire chapel is done in fresco painting. And fresco is a technique many of you probably have never heard about or know very much about. So I need to explain it to you. It's a very durable technique. It's a very slow, methodical technique. It's a technique that Michelangelo used to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's essentially a wall painting technique. Easel paintings don't work well with fresco. Fresco is for large mural programs such as we see here at the Renna Chapel. Now let me explain how it works. Let's see the next image. Okay. I don't have my button up here, so I'm going to walk up and point things. Notice this is one of the panels in that painting. This is the lower level which represents Christ's passion. Notice the background sky. It almost looks like landscape back there, but those are simply breaks between the blue. And the reason they're there is the fresco technique is essentially, oh good, thank you, a staining technique. It's not a painting technique the way we think of painting. Here's the way it works. It's meant, as I say, for walls. You have a rough layer of plaster, but then you only plaster with a final layer, usually only about 1/8 of an inch thick, that's a much finer white plaster with marble dust mixed into it. You paint an area that you can paint in one day. And no more than that, because you've got to paint when the plaster is wet. Your medium, your liquid, your carrier, is lime water. And lime water is what mixes the paint, the pigment, and carries it to the support, which is this wet plaster. So basically, this is a staining technique. The paint goes through the thickness. The reason you don't have it super thick is that it'll absorb too much of the pigment if it's super thick. But you only paint as much as you can paint in one day. Any of you who have done staining know it's almost impossible to match staining from one day to the next day, because atmospheric conditions seem to affect the depth that the stain penetrates. So you have to really plan way ahead of time how to do a fresco painting. The term cartoon, which you've heard of, is in fact developed for the fresco technique. A cartoon is a large paper drawing that represents the entire subject you're going to paint. And it's usually just a line drawing. They poke holes, usually charcoal is the linear medium. They poke holes all along that line area. And then they lay that against the damp plaster and take a bag of charcoal dust and tamp it against that cartoon, pull the cartoon away, and now you have little black dots that outline the direction your subject matter is going. The thing with fresco is if you don't pre-plan like that, you're in trouble, because you can't make it up as you go along, because in fact, if you do something you don't like, it can't be changed. You can't paint over it. It's a staining technique. You simply chip it away and come back the next day and do some more. So it's a very difficult, time-consuming technique, but it lasts forever. You can see the dating here on this chapel, and it still has pretty solid colors. Now this is a painting by Giotto, which is probably, I'm probably going to use a little hyperbole here, but this is probably one of the most important paintings ever made. When you look at this, it probably looks kind of primitive to you in terms of its level of realism. I explained to you as a group in the past that I'm especially interested in the beginning of styles before they develop elaborate technical virtuosity, because the content, the idea of a style is most evident in these primitive forms. Giotto is like 100 years in front of everybody else in painting like this. First of all, notice we've got a blue background, not a gold background. Also notice the scene is located in a real world. We have a rocky landscape with a withered tree in the landscape. Notice another thing he does. He creates a kind of shallow space. If you look here, here's a kind of ledge. It's almost like a theatrical stage space. Giotto's spaces are typically 8-10 feet deep. And so you get this ledge that everyone's seated on or standing on, and then you define the background with this rock ledge, and that frames the scene. Now the scene here is totally different in spirit from those Eastern Greek icon paintings. Totally different way of thinking about art. First of all, notice how massive the figures are. They may look crude to you in terms of modern day realism and photography, but they're very solid, massive figures. Again, he tends to place a couple figures in the foreground to establish the outer perimeter of the space. Now, what I really want to get at, however, those are some of the technical innovations of this painting. What really is important here is the content of the painting. Giotto cares about this world, the real world. He looks at the real world and he tries to start imitating it. But he's a person of deep faith and deep devotion. And so what he's doing is taking the real world and making it a stage or an arena to express his faith. So faith still exists. It's not a godless, immaterial, insignificant kind of way of thinking. Faith is still dominant here, but it's dominant in the real world. It's not in another place, and it's not, in this case, it's in another time. And because it's here and now, he comes up with a really dramatic way to represent the meaning of the work. The meaning is no longer just because these figures have halos. It's there because of human feeling. Here we have the body of Christ reclining in a death pose. You look at the relationship between Mary and Jesus. Look at the intensity of Mary's feeling as she reacts to the death of her son. Here we have Mary Magdalene at the end of the body, examining the wounds of Christ's feet. We have these foreground figures that sort of establish the physical space in which this drama occurs. This figure here is probably John, the Apostle John. And then we have grieving figures here, and notice what's most significant, I think, about the painting. In fact, the earlier version of this painting, we had cut off the upper part of the painting. So I said, I need another version of this painting that gives us the full sky. The reason I want you to see that is, look at those angels. Look at how they're all reacting to this event. They're sort of tumbling about in the sky. This is no longer a removed heavenly event. This is an event that happens here and now, and even heaven weeps and mourns at what has happened here. Notice the colors are bright but relatively restrained. Fresco does not give us super bright colors. But typically now, for instance, notice the way he calibrates the emotion. Back here, you've got two disciples. They have halos, so they're probably disciples. But notice they're not reacting. He creates a kind of drama. Think of a rock thrown in a puddle, and the waves sort of radiate outward. That's the way the emotion works in this particular scene. These guys simply stand and are probably talking and thinking about the meaning of what's happened here. So we get the whole range of human emotion, and it's all carefully calibrated to get maximum emotional effect. Now, can I see the next one, please? Yeah. We're going backwards a little bit in style, even though not in time. You'll notice the date here on this one is 1311. It's another Maesta. This one was made for the Siena Cathedral, and it's a huge painting, 13 feet wide. Now, the artist is Duccio. Duccio is the master we associate with Siena. Giotto is the master we associate with Florence. Giotto designed the campanile that's next to the Florentine Duomo Cathedral. So Giotto, and he has some of his paintings in the cathedral itself, I might add. Duccio is associated with Siena, and as you can see, he's still working in the Greek style. The figures seem in some ways more technically adept than Giotto's figures. They seem more human, more graceful and slender-bodied, and you're going to get a better sense of that when we look at the back of this panel in a moment. Anyway, Duccio is noted for creating beautiful, graceful figures, and you get a sense of that. But you can see he's really affected by that Byzantine style. Although the Madonna is wearing the dark blue, and blue and red, by the way, are always associated with the Madonna. The Madonna is supposedly seated in a throne, but it's pretty hard to understand that thing. It looks more like a building, yet it's sort of flattened out. It doesn't have much depth to it. Now, can we see the next one, please? Typically, with these large paintings, they were meant for the altar area of a church. And remember, the Italian churches are architecturally simpler, so there's room to look at painting in most Italian churches. The northern churches have such complex stonework, there's hardly any place for painting to exist. The back panel, this is part of the back of the painting we just saw. There's a series of sections in there dealing with the life of Christ. Notice this particular painting is 3 feet 4 inches wide. It's obvious that Duccio is thinking in some ways like Giotto is thinking, because he's dealing with an emotional scene here. This is Christ as he's being arrested. He's being kissed by Judas. Here's Peter cutting off the servant's ear. I can't identify for sure, but I think this is probably the high priest. Here are disciples fleeing. So it's clearly an emotional scene. If you look at the shading on the draperies, the general physiognomy of the figures, in some ways it's more realistic, more technically accurate painting than Giotto would be. But it's nowhere near as innovative. Yes, he's got a natural scene here that frames it, but notice he's still dealing with a gold ground, a flat ground. Also notice, look at the feet, typically in a Gothic type painting. The figures are almost like marionettes. They're almost suspended in space. They don't stand on the ground because they don't do foreshortening. They like to show the full silhouette of the figure. So you notice over here especially, these figures seem to be almost suspended in space. You don't get that weightiness that we just saw with the Giotto a few moments ago. Now, can we see the next one, please? This is the town that Duccio was painting in. This is the palazzo, the downtown in the open square of Siena. Remember, Siena, Florence, and Pisa are all Tuscan cities. This is a time in Italy where it's a kind of city-state government, which basically means these guys all compete with each other, sometimes battle each other for disputed territory between them, and they're fiercely competitive. I'm thinking of fierce competition when I look at this, because some of you might have seen there's a dramatic event happens in this square. I've actually sat in the square eating lunch with my students, but around the square is a road they cover with sand once or twice a year, and they have a horse race. And each neighborhood in Siena sponsors one horse and one rider. I think there are 17 neighborhoods in Siena. And they all compete for this banner that they carry to the cathedral that's a banner of the Virgin. And it's a kind of friendly competition, but there are no rules at all. It's just a wild free-for-all. Once the rope drops, these horses and riders take off. They can pull each other off their horses and so on. They do what they can. Anyway, it's a kind of wild competition, but this is the civic town hall. Florence has its town hall that we're going to look at in the spring. Typically, I want you to notice, though, this town hall, it's a blocky kind of building. Notice it looks almost more like a castle than it does a civic building, because it has castellations at the top. That's that jagged line you see at the top. Now, on castles, that kind of castellation functions because you're protecting yourself from attack. You're hiding behind the castellation section, and then you peer out and shoot your bow and arrow or drop liquid lead or boiling pitch or whatever on your enemies. Well, that's exactly why these buildings are made this way, because this is not a stable time in Italian governance. Sometimes the town leaders had to fortress themselves inside of the Palazzo Pubblico. And so it's designed to be a fortress. And by the way, there are iron grids on the windows below. So it's meant to be a fortress and at the same time a civic building. But it indicates the power of towns in Italy. In France, we saw Chartres, which is a town, and the power of that town and its school allowed them to build that great cathedral. They did not, however, create quite as large and imposing civic structures as this. Now, can I see the next one, please? This is a fresco painting inside that same building we saw. There are a couple of these paintings there that's a long mural cycle. This particular one is the good government panel. There is a good government in the city. Next to this, it leads to a panel, good government in the country. And in an opposing wall, you have bad government in the city and bad government in the country. You notice The whole idea here is try to create some sense of harmony of civic life. I think one of the most telling groups here is this group of women dancing. The trades carry on in various places here. There's no sense of violence. The composition is fairly quiet and stable. And notice there's serious attempts at rendering architecture. We're no longer in that heavenly realm. This world matters. Civic life matters. Civic peace matters. So there's an attempt to actually represent part of the town. As I understand it, these buildings are actual buildings that are there. But if you look at this thing carefully, if you look at each building, it seems like a fairly solid structure by itself. But there's no systematic way to put this all together. Linear perspective has not been invented yet. We're going to get to the Renaissance in the spring and see what linear perspective does. So each of these buildings lives in a separate space from the one next to it. It's not completely coherent in terms of its spatial presentation, but there's clearly a need here. And when there's a need, eventually we find a technique to meet that need. Can we see the next one, please? This, of course, is the Duomo in Florence. This dome you see there is the baptistry that's in front of the Duomo. Remember, Italians typically have a baptistry in front of the church. It symbolizes you have to be baptized to be a part of the faith community. Here's Giotto's Campanile. Again, the Italians typically have a separate bell tower. This Campanile is designed by Giotto, and again, notice it's kind of clear geometry. Yes, it's a tall structure, but in fact, it has a kind of earthy clarity about it. And notice the cathedral itself, apart from the dome, is essentially got a horizontal axis to it. When we get to the Renaissance, we're going to have spend some more time talking about this dome. I'm going to have to get my board out here again and show you how Brunelleschi came up with that dome, because in fact, although you don't get a sense of it from this particular slide, that's the biggest dome that had been created up to that time, with the exception of Hagia Sophia. And he came up with a technique for building it. Ironically, the aspirations of the Florentines, which were always super ambitious. Remember, these city-states are competing with each other. And so they build a cathedral with this space for the dome, and they have no idea how they can make a dome that big. But that's their ambition. Almost 80 years later, a guy named Brunelleschi comes along and says, wait a minute, I think I know how to do that. And when we get to the Renaissance, we'll talk about him. One other thing you want to be aware of, and it's something I've never understood about the Italian makeup. If you look at that dome, this is the proper kind of ornamentation that should be there. You have the lantern at the top. It's an 8-ribbed dome, and then this is the kind of final structure. But notice here, we just see raw concrete. The Italians don't always finish the outside of their churches. In fact, in Florence, there are 12 churches that do not have a facade. And in fact, the front of this church, you can't see it, it's hidden behind the campanile. That was only put on there in the early 1800s. I think of San Lorenzo, which is one of the important churches in Florence. It's got really important sculpture in it. It was done by a great architect. The facade is this just raw brick and concrete facade. It's literally across the street from the Medici Palace. It was their home church. So it's got all this great art in the inside. The facade is still a raw brick front. They just never finished it off. It just takes a huge amount of money with these ornamental, all these colored marbles and everything, and they seem pretty casual about this sort of thing. Can we see the next one, please? Here's the interior of that cathedral. Yes, it's tall, but it's nowhere near as tall as the French churches are. And notice, because of the way they support it, the side aisle now seems to be a part of the main nave section of the church. And it also leaves, they don't have as many windows. You see here we have a few lancet windows along the side. So there's more empty wall space. Here's a fairly important painting, and typically there are chapels around the side of these churches, but that side aisle space becomes a part of the main space of the cathedral. Someone is probably going to ask me, were those rods there when it was originally built? As far as I know, those are modern additions, because these structures are starting to settle and they put those in to stabilize them. But you'll notice, again, no seats. I mean, here you have wooden seats up front, but patterned floors, usually beautiful. The Italians do beautiful parquet work with marble. The Siena Cathedral has giant biblical scenes on the floor of the cathedral as well. By the way, Brunelleschi, who's the guy who helped figure out this dome area here, he's buried underneath this church. There's a little crypt down there, and Brunelleschi is buried down there. But notice we're in the late 12s here. We're not quite even into the 1300s yet with this structure. But you can see it's just not, oh yeah, it's got pointed arches, but it's just not a Gothic way of thinking. It's much more down-to-earth way of thinking about things. Can we see the next one, please? Look at the date on what we're looking at here. This is a panel for a pulpit that's in the baptistry of the Pisa Cathedral. This is by Nicola Pisano, but I wanted you to see this to get a sense how the Italians are connected to their classic past. Remember, the ruins of the Roman Empire have never left Italy, so the Italians are surrounded by the ruins of the Roman Empire. In fact, they can look at Roman sarcophagi. I showed you some of the Roman sarcophagi when we looked at that, and this particular panel is pretty much representative of that Roman style. In fact, if you look at here's the Annunciation, there's the angel, there's Mary pulling back from the angel. Here's Mary reclining. If you look at her head, that's just basically a Greek classic head. Joseph gets put off to the side in all these panels. He's a kind of secondary player in that. Here's the Christ child here being washed by these maidens, and he also up here reclining. You've got the shepherds up here, and angels and the sheep of the nativity scene. Notice everything is kind of jammed in there, how active and crowded that whole scene looks. But you see how the Italians have never forgotten that classic full-bodied past, and you get a sense of that, especially as you look at this main matron figure. You get a sense of an actual body underneath that drapery. Now can we see the next one? This is the very same scene done by the Son. This is Giovanni's Nativity and Annunciation. You'll notice it's 40 or 50 years after the Father's panel. This is a good example of a style that becomes part of the pre- or proto-Renaissance. The style associated with this particular painting is called sometimes Universal Gothic. It's actually more of a Gothic look than the last panel we saw. Notice it doesn't look as crowded. It's got the same number of figures. Notice Mary is reclining now, much more naturalistic looking, and she doesn't look as Greek, she looks thinner. Here's the Annunciation, the angel, here Mary pulling back. Here Joseph is sitting in the corner, kind of meditating on what all this means. Servant girls washing the Christ. Here's the Christ, they're putting water in the laver. Here are our animals and our shepherds. And surely there are a lot of things are happening. Here's a reclining Christ, a donkey and a cow sort of looking over the reclining Christ. Angels up in the heavens. It's got as much subject matter as the last one, but it's much more integrated. It's much more together. The Gothic presence didn't disappear during the pre-Renaissance. These styles are sort of fighting each other. In fact, when I opened the presentation on the Renaissance, I might show you the two competition panels that were for the door of the baptistry. One of them is done in the Renaissance style. The one that actually won the competition is done in the Universal or International Gothic style. And the Gothic style is thinner figures and much more fluid kind of approach, but very realistic. Again, I want to emphasize the fact realism didn't start with the Renaissance. In fact, the Renaissance was kind of primitive in its realism. The Gothic builders were the ones who really developed the whole realistic approach, but by themselves, without any classic past to copy. And that influence eventually happens here in Italy. And then can we see the next one? I wanted you to get a sense of that Gothic style in Italy. This is San Michele. This is actually a strange structure. It was actually a grain market. And this beautiful little tabernacle is all carved out of intricate stone with the Madonna enthroned by Dadi and Orcagna. It was the sculptor who made this particular tabernacle. You notice how it definitely has a Gothic look to it. One of the features of the Gothic style is elegant materials. It's an aristocratic style, so it uses a lot of gold and fancy materials, and you get a sense of that. with this particular tabernacle. I have vivid memories of this. This thing is a fabulous structure. It's like many of the monuments in Florence. You can just walk in there. There's no fee required. I would come by here and pray for a moment or two, because I would walk by this on the way to teach my classes on Renaissance art in Florence, and I would typically stop here on the way and be there all by myself. Anyone could walk in there. If anyone wanted to do damage to this, there's no guards there or anything like that. If you look carefully, you see you've got angel figures represented here sculpturally, fully three-dimensional figures, but of course nowhere near life size. So there are influences of the more physical kind of aspect of sculpture here, but most of this is kind of a fancy work, heavenly Gothic vision, a kind of I think of kind of elaborate wedding cakes and so on. It's just kind of this castle in the sky. Now, believe it or not, the reason I wanted to finish with this is I want to remind you of something we talked about last time. We saw those magnificent cathedrals being built through the 1300s. We saw the pre-Renaissance happening in Italy in the 1300s. At that very time, the plague was devastating all of Europe. In some places, over half the population of Europe died in some towns. And this particular monument is a memorial for the plague. That's part of its grandeur, and with the seated Madonna painting in its center, as a kind of way of commemorating these awful times and trying to bring a heavenly sort of sense of, we got through it, thank you, God, as a feeling for it. Now, the very same building, this is the inn. When we start the Renaissance lectures, I'm going to show you some sculptures by a guy named Donatello on the outside of this very same building that really all of a sudden are going to look very familiar to you, because they're going to look like what you would think of as Renaissance art. Now, I left a couple minutes here for questions. Do we have any questions? I'll try to do a better job today than I did last time.
What's the overall dimensions of this?
I would guess it's maybe 18, 20 feet high. And you can set their pews right in front of this thing, and you can sit right just a couple feet away from it. And in fact, off to the side over here is an altar and a bit of a church sanctuary. It's a kind of odd little building. As I say, you can just walk in, no guards, no fee. Anything else? Anyone else? Yes?
On the Annunciation, I think it was the first one, the upper left-hand side, it looked like modern script, was like a date or something like that.
I think that was from the photograph I took off the internet. I don't think it was part of the...
Well, as I said, it definitely looked like it was modern, not
Yeah. Keep in mind, 1300s is still a time when people are mostly illiterate. The vast majority of Europeans have nothing to read. The printing press hasn't been developed yet, and they have no ability to read. But they are still opening themselves to the real world, and it's hard for us to get a full sense of what it meant to live in that time of intense faith because your only durable institution is the church. And you because you're illiterate, you can't read the Bible. In fact, the Bible is not available to you. It took Luther to translate the Bible into vernacular German to start that idea of faithful Christians being able to read the Bible. Right now, the church is basically telling you what to think and how to respond. And one other thing I need to perhaps tell you, this is a time when the mendicant orders start to develop. I don't know if you know what I mean by mendicant orders. That means monastic communities that take vows of poverty. The reason they do that is they see their role as the mission of the church to help the poor and the weak. The Dominicans and the Franciscans are both orders that happened during the 1300s. The very fact that they care about the poor and the weak. Before this time, well, who cares how much they're suffering in this world? As long as they're faithful, they're going to go to paradise. Now the church starts to pay attention, and they are actually Reformation-type bodies in the Catholic Church. The Pope, believe it or not, was no longer in Rome in the 1300s. He's in Avignon, France, and these orders start to develop apart from the papacy and in reaction to the lushness and the corruption that are associated with the papacy. Long before Luther, the Catholic Church had an inner vision about its own life and tried to reform itself, and it did some of that reformation during the period we're talking about. It's curious, in Florence, these two bodies actually both cared, of course, about the poor in Florence. The Franciscans on the east side of town built Santa Croce. The Dominicans on the west side of town built Santa Maria Novella. So they tried not to compete with each other, but they both had that same sense of mission. Okay, that even, in fact, went beyond your questions. Any final question I can respond to? Yes?
What type of equipment did they have back?
I'm not sure I'm hearing you.
What type of machinery or equipment did they have, or was it all hand done when they made these beautiful?
There is no machinery. This is all hand carved. I'm a sculptor myself, and I can carve stone, so I know how much work a structure like this would be. But this is a time when the trades have really started to develop. And by the way, art was just one of the trades. Artists were not regarded as geniuses. They were just simply regarded as craftsmen. And to be an artist, for instance, to learn that complex fresco technique, you had to be a part of a craft workshop, and eventually you get licensed to be a free artist and even start your own workshop. But it's a very carefully controlled craft system, and the carving that you see here was part of that technical virtuosity of that kind of trade craft system. When I went to school, I had to teach myself stone carving because my professors didn't carve in stone, and so I had none of the kind of elaborate stone carving education these particular artists would do. And although I regard myself a fairly good stone carver, I couldn't carve something like this. There's no way. Okay, it's well beyond our time now. Thank you for coming again, folks. Amen.